Okay, everybody, we might as well start. So good morning and welcome to our session on policing pandemics, the past, present and future of policing pandemics. My name's Carl Roberts and I am Professor of Policing and Criminal Justice at University of Western Sydney. I also work as a consultant in biosecurity and policing for the World Health Organization. What we've gathered together this morning is a group of three, well, there's me and two really good speakers. And what we want to do really is just to try and talk around some of the learning from both the history of the present from this current COVID situation and the future of pandemic policing. Just as a slight caveat, given the complexity of modern life, our second speaker, well, who would have been our first speaker was Mark Harrison, Professor Mark Harrison. He will join us a little bit later because he's got called to a late meeting. So he will join us sometime in the next half an hour. So we're going to slightly do it in slightly different. Obviously, the logical running order would be the past, present and future. This time we're going to start with the present, jump to the past and then look to the future. So that's kind of the running order we've got when Mark joins us. But I'd just like to thank all the attendees for coming to this session. I know people have got busy and hectic lives, especially during various lockdowns at various parts of the world. And so good morning, good afternoon and evening to you wherever you happen to be in the world. And without further ado, we'll begin. So we're going to start with myself and I will just share my screen with you and get the presentation running. Hopefully everybody can see this. All right, so as I said, the three presenters are myself, Victoria Harrington and Mark Harrison. So to begin, obviously the world has been experiencing a pandemic disease for the last 12 months or slightly more, depending on where you are in the world. And police have had a role within that. And so within this particular session, what we thought we'd like to do is have a look at where we are, how we've come to be where we are and what we might do in the future. So really throughout the session, to just give you a sense of what we're at here, we want to look at how pandemics have been, are and could be policed. And throughout the three presentations, what I'd like you to do is think through your response to these three core questions that we kind of want to sort of consider, we will consider as we go. And what does history actually teach us about policing pandemics? Who are the police? And I put police in quotes in pandemics because potentially many, many different groups of people could police. And I'm also aware that someone is sweeping up behind me. So I apologize. Hopefully that's if you get bored with what I'm saying, you can watch what she's doing. What does success actually look like for policing pandemics? What is a successful outcome? And really what we aim to do with this session, perhaps not to give you answers even, but just to provoke questions and provoke challenges. And we hope that it does do exactly that, provoke. With regard to this session, what we're going to do is we're going to get questions at the end. So we're going to do the three presentations first and then put questions at the end. And if you could put the questions in the chat facility on Zoom, I think most people should be familiar with Zoom, but at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat button that if you press that and then you can sort of type your question there. And what we'll do is we'll endeavour to cover as many of them as we can as we go. Okay. These are our three presenters, and just to give you a sense of who they are, we've got Professor Mark Harrison, who will speak after me, who's a Professor of History of Medicine from the University of Oxford, and is also co-director of the Wellcome Centre for Ethics and Humanities, and he's going to talk about the historical perspectives. Myself, who I've already introduced you to, and Dr. Victoria Harrington, who is Director of Knowledge at the Australian Institute of Police Management in Australia. And that's it. So the first bit is me, and I'm going to be talking about lessons from the current pandemic. And that's who I am. And now you can get in touch with me if you need to. So we've used this term a lot. COVID-19 has created unprecedented challenges throughout the world for everybody, for individuals, right the way through to police, governments, and so on. Nobody really had a sense of what a modern day worldwide pandemic would look like, or what would happen, or who would be the core actors and key actors in actually dealing with this. And in a policing sense, what we've seen is, and in fact, in every sense, but in policing in particular, we've seen a wide range of practices and various levels of contribution to health outcomes. that have varied throughout the world, dependent on historical perspective that policing comes from, the particular cultural context in which policing has occurred, the particular people who are in charge of planning legislation and also running the police response. And really what I want to do in this particular presentation is explore some of the factors that have been relevant to this or that have influenced these police responses, and really try and identify some of the challenges and learning that can inform future policing. But before we start, here's some images from the pandemic, and I'll go around these and just explain these. So, you know, we've heard a lot about draconian police measures. Well, here we go. The top left-hand corner that I'm hovering the mouse over there, these are police spraying migrant workers with bleach, just in case they're infected with the disease. Here's some police trying to move a man off the street who's breaching a lockdown. Moving here, the man holding this great big arm here, this was called a COVID, I think it was called a COVID spear. The idea being that in order to maintain social distance between the police officer and individual, this hook was wrapped around somebody to keep them 6 feet apart. Again, more police clearing the streets. And the top right, if you're not from the UK, you may not be familiar with this image. It was a very famous one from about a week ago, where a young woman was murdered, actually walking home from her friends by a police officer. And this was a woman being moved away by police from a vigil that had been organised against police advice, but a vigil from a large number of women and some men to really just remember the life they want to protest against violence against women. And police broke up the protest, and this image was flashed pretty much around all the UK press of the police who'd wrestled the woman to the floor and handcuffed her. And this was at a sort of silent memorial vigil. So I mean, collectively we can see some quite, for want of a better, very strong arm securitized police responses. This contrasts with these images. These are also from the pandemic. This is a police officer helping out at a testing site and directing people to where they need to go. We have a police officer here who's pouring, I think this is some hand sanitizer onto the hands of a homeless person. Here we've got 2 images of police providing food and water to, again, people who are homeless, particularly disadvantaged people. And what we've seen also is challenges for police, not only in terms of what they've done and the differences in how they've policed things, but also in terms of the impact upon them themselves. So here's a headline from, I think it was The Independent in the United Kingdom: police officer infected with coronavirus shares safety fears over PPE. And in the argument, the police officer is saying that it was woefully inadequate what he was presented with. Here's another one: Cambridgeshire police officer, again, UK story, who was spat at by suspects test positive for COVID-19. Again, not an uncommon experience of a number of police officers, of people coughing at, spitting on, and telling them that they'd actually been infected. Other headlines that we've seen during the pandemic: police trauma warning after one officer called to 15 COVID-related deaths in 24 hours. Many more deaths than perhaps this individual would perhaps even see in a month or a year even. COVID-19 police officer on front line of pandemic faces reduced forces, little to no protective equipment, another PPE issue. And COVID-19 curbs community policing at a time of diminishing trust. So again, all of those stories tell us something about the different ways that the police have policed COVID-19 and the various government restrictions and regulations, and also about some of the impacts that policing has had upon the individuals themselves. And so what I want to do as I go through the rest of this presentation is kind of taking some of those examples together, thinking about the questions we asked at the start, to talk about the kind of policing context and the impact this has had and what we might learn from it moving forward. So what I've tried to do, we've been doing a lot of research through both the work I've done at Th1 and also some of the things we've been doing through Th1 to look at the kind of policing context. What was the circumstances and situation that have kind of impacted on the police and what they've chosen to do and how they've chosen to do it? And really, as we've looked at this, we've kind of identified really 4 key themes that sort of come out that seem highly relevant to the policing context and what police have actually done. So the first sort of key drivers, key theme has been the legislation and criminal justice and relations with criminal justice. And when we're going to talk about each of these in turn. The second being is in the kind of engagement police have had with other stakeholders in their planning and response to COVID-19. The third bit is the police wellbeing part, about the impact that all of this has had on policing and their kind of attitudes, behaviours, beliefs, and so on. And the fourth bit is how all of this kind of ties together in this kind of wonderfully interactive soup about how police have engaged with communities, what they've actually done, how they police this, which is exemplified by the photographs I showed earlier. So the first of these is this idea of policing of legislation and criminal justice, and kind of central to police responses here have been the idea of pandemic planning, about what was done even before the pandemic appeared. As you may well be aware, every nation on Earth who is part of the World Health Organization has to put together a pandemic plan. And these are usually structured around how you'd respond to pandemic influenza. And within that, nations talk about how they would, from a public health and medical perspective, and they're driven very much by public health opinions, how you would deal with this. And these plans are assessed by WHO, and people are generally considered to be, at a level that they can respond. Now, they vary massively. There's about 162 of these, and they vary in content from hundreds of pages to about 3 to 4 sides of A4, and often very much associated with whether it's a high income or low income country, etc., and about the capacity and capability of the countries themselves. But these have sort of started as a starting point for much of the pandemic planning internationally. But generally, if we look at these, what we've seen is the police pretty much internationally have not really been part of those plans very much. They've sort of been peripherally mentioned, but never really been central to the planning until the pandemic actually hit and there was a desire to a need to respond. So there wasn't sort of any pre-planning that involved the police too much. And in fact, even during the planning, we've seen, even during the pandemic itself, we've seen governments have seldom really considered the kind of implications for police about the judgments they've made. So what we've seen, for example, in the case of the international health regulations that I mentioned on this slide, is that if you read through them, the comment about police is often that the police will carry, in the event of a pandemic, the police will carry out duties as usual and other duties as needed, right? Which is incredibly vague. And that's in those plans that actually even think about the police at all. The vast majority don't even mention the police as having any involvement in this space at all. And so from that, it seems this is sort of driven by, I think, potentially a lack of appreciation or knowledge of, by government, by public health even, of the sorts of contribution police can make. It's almost like the police are sort of there as a tool that you perhaps would use, but no real sense of, well, how you would even use them. They just sort of do stuff, and it may be hopeful, and we can actually make use of them. I think sometimes also this is driven a little bit by police not necessarily engaging too well with those stakeholders as well in various places where police have really seen themselves as a sort of siloed entity separate from anyone else. And also, I think often there's a sense that a broad perception that in any event, the police are sort of like, you sort of last line fielder, they're sort of service of last resort who you call on when there's kind of nobody else. And we've done a number of webinars through GLEFA where we've spoken to police officers from around the world, and they've spoken about being seen as that, if nobody's going to do the job, then the police do it. So often there's almost this kind of wastebasket sense of policing where, whatever the problem, they go off and do it. There's a kind of a broad effect of all of this, though, is that when legislation's been written, and police have complained about this internationally, it's often been vague and unclear without any real sense of the extent to which police can even enforce it at all. And this, as we'll see later on, has had a significant impact upon the way in which COVID-19 has been policed in certain places. We've got examples from the world over of police being told literally the night before or 2 or 3 days after the start of a curfew or a lockdown as to what actually their powers even are, whether they can criminalize people on the spot fine and so on, and that which makes planning incredibly difficult from a policing perspective. There's also been issues with criminal justice in the sense of the courts, and this has had a major impact on policing. The courts quite reasonably have said, well, we don't want to raise the risk of infection, so to reduce infection control, we'll social distance the courts, if not close some of them down, reduce the amount of trials, etc., that we can operate. And of course, this has created significant backlogs. Of course, this has an impact downstream on policing because to begin with, it starts to cause problems and challenges in terms of the attitudes of police and the public about the usefulness of criminal justice generally in courts and whether or not you'll gain justice if you even try to go to law to get to a court. In some places worldwide, we've seen this as sort of encouraged a kind of taking the law into your own hands, draconian sort of approach toward policing COVID-19. If it's not going to go to court, what's the point of pushing this? Let's deal with it right now. Many legislatures have kind of created this sort of on-the-spot fine context. But of course, that puts an awful lot of challenge to police, because it rests often on their discretion as to whether you'll find somebody or not. And of course, this can lead to variations in practice in the same area. And on top of that, of course, individuals where fines have been brought in are often feel they're being criminalized for just everyday behaviors, just going out into the street for a breath of fresh air and being out too long, or even attempting to get to work, as we'll see from people who are particularly disadvantaged. And again, so this sense of fairness has been challenged here. This is a pretty busy slide, so apologises for this, but it sort of flashes up other things. So the second of those issues I wanted to talk about is this engagement with other stakeholders. And really, from a policing perspective, there are lots of stakeholders that exist in this place, ranging from government, ranging from health and public health, emergency, other emergency services, the military, various NGOs, various community groups, various local power brokers, all of whom potentially it's useful for the police to engage with and work with during their policing of pandemics. Of course, there are many, many challenges at City, and they're the usual challenges. I'm not going to go through these in turn, but they're the usual challenges that exist when you've got agencies that are often set up to be quite siloed. You know, we're the police and we do this, and we have these operating procedures. Their health, they do that, and they have other operating procedures. So we've seen at the start of the pandemic where groups were sort of brought together by necessity, where planning hadn't necessarily occurred beforehand, different groups sitting down and sort of almost defining their territory and saying, well, you know, we definitely do this. Police in the UK very keen to say that their job was about things like enforcement, engagement, and so on. And in other places, the police job was enforcement, but we will not do anything that's really sort of health related. And how public health people sort of say, well, you know, we're not going to do any of the enforcement stuff because that's not our powers. And this has led to all kinds of things. And, you know, there's been potentially gaps in provision where agencies are keen to stress what they don't do. Turf wars, often failures to share relevant information. And often it sits on that basis of people trusting one another, not really understanding what each other does. And potentially, and we've seen examples of this, agencies like police doing things that are actually counterproductive to the aims of other people. And again, as we look at the engagement between police and public, we'll see that things like violent police enforcement has often led to protests. And of course, protests where large groups of people, where mass gatherings have occurred, are a potential risk of infection. So you kind of get this sort of cyclic, almost failings in the system of the behaviour of particular groups that impact negatively on the behaviour of other agencies. So again, the idea here is that, you know, good working relationships really are critical to COVID, you know, pandemic policing, and indeed any other emergency. But more than that is, you know, they're not really great to develop on the hoof on that day. You know, it hits the fan, as it were, and then you have to sort of develop your relationships. They're almost things that need to evolve and be developed over time. And silos need to be sort of reduced somewhat in order to get better relationships moving forward in the event of an emergency. The whole police wellbeing issue is pretty central to this. And this is a recurrent theme when we've talked about with police about the COVID-19 experience. Protecting officers from infection has been fundamental, you know, because obviously if you don't protect your officers, people get sick. If they get sick, you get high levels of absenteeism. If you get that, then individuals end up doing more work. They don't get time off. They often get placed doing jobs that they're not qualified for or experienced in. And all of this can cause all sorts of challenges in policing that can impact really negatively on things like staff morale, on their willingness to engage with communities. I mean, one of the great challenges that a number of officers have expressed to me is, you know, going from various nations, going to work with inadequate PPE, attending individuals who you don't really know their infection status. In that space, thinking about your family and your own risk of infection, you know, you think about yourself, I don't want to get ill. Thinking about your family, I don't want to take an infection back to my family. So of course, already you start from that position. How then do I maintain and do my job whilst keeping myself safe? And of course, in certain places, this has kind of created particular types of pejorative policing. We've heard police use terms around the world of COVID suspects, you know, in a sense, equating somebody who potentially is sick or of unknown illness status with somebody who is a suspect, i.e. an offender, you know, that being ill is a kind of form of offence. And of course, that's problematic because that then starts to predict how you might treat and deal with that individual. Of course, as we've seen on those slides I showed earlier, you know, cops have been exposed to significantly more death and suffering than they would do. They've been exposed to people shouting insults at them and spitting at them, notwithstanding how that's kind of interacted with the policing strategies that have been chosen by police. So again, you always see this kind of spinning wheel almost of, police officers becoming scared and afraid that they might get infected, so they do particular things that reduce their risk of infection. But of course, that then means the public starts to get upset with the police officers and protest ensue. And so you see this kind of where does it stop kind of spinning wheel state. And ultimately, the challenge of being in certain places being unable to maintain police well-being has had a number of negative consequences or unintended consequences, which have to a large degree impacted upon how police have policed and also how the public then in turn have responded back to the police. And as we move into police engagement with communities, in a sense, this is the central feature of policing. And for me, how all of the aforementioned kind of links together and interacts starts to create the sort of strategies that we've seen in various places around the world to police. And we've seen some of the worst examples and some of the best examples of the different policing models and ideas that have been created. We've seen some problematic enforcement strategies, inconsistent policing. And as I mentioned, this can often arise from uncertainty about legislation, uncertainty about your own personal safety and so on. Where we've seen variation between officers within the same jurisdiction. I think there's a celebrated situation in the United Kingdom of two women who went out for a walk, both with a cup of herbal tea, socially distanced, etc., to a beauty spot. And they were sort of pounced upon by police officers who fined them because they said they were having a picnic and not indulging in walking. There was a distinction in the legislation about between whether what's a picnic, sort of outdoor meal, as it were, versus actually going for exercise. And you could exercise, but you certainly couldn't have a meal. Or how long do you sit on a park bench? Is that, when you're outside and you're supposed to be inside, sitting on a park bench isn't exercise, therefore you're in breach, so that person be fined or not. And some officers with their discretion will fine and some won't. And that can often be a product of what your day's been like up until then. If you've been spat at, insulted, threatened, maybe the next person you come across, you're much more likely to do something negative to them. You shouldn't, but you're a human being, okay? And of course, in extremis, we've seen police officers, and we've seen in some of the very low-income countries, police have, again, tied into the history of policing in those places, but often, and as I say, the levels of trust community generally has for police in those places, we've seen police overusing draconian and violent enforcement tactics. I think in Uganda, in the early days of the pandemic, more people had died from police action to enforce lockdown than had actually even got COVID-19, let alone died from it. So again, these challenges exist. Again, it doesn't excuse it, but in some senses, if you see this as a kind of interactive system, you start to see, well, if cops have got very little support and are vilified and so on, potentially they may use these tactics to sort of protect themselves. I don't want to get sick and take this stuff home. This, of course, has negative implications, of course, because if the police use these kind of tactics, what happens? You get criticisms of police, trust between community and police goes down, you get reduced compliance, we found, where the trust doesn't exist between police and communities. People find workarounds and ways to get away from the regulations. Obviously, we see injury and death, avoidable injury and death of members of the public, which is in itself a public health hazard. And of course, we then see evidence of approaches. Then we've also seen some evidence, quite interestingly, where police have been very sort of securitized and threatening and violent in their approaches. There's sort of some evidence of greater acceptance of conspiracy theories, that COVID doesn't really exist, and that what we're seeing really is just government using a strategy to enable force and enforced compliance. Disadvantaged groups have been particularly challenged, as they always are. As we say, the pandemics tend to root out all of the inequalities that pre-exist, and no difference here. The most vulnerable disadvantages, unsurprisingly, tend to get ill more often and more seriously ill, and tend to be more at risk of dying. But of course, they've also in parallel experienced the greatest levels of police enforcement action. Of course, these are things we need to unpick. I mean, some of the reasons, perhaps not all, but some of them are often because these are the people least able to follow the lockdown guidance. If you've got no water in your house, if you haven't got a fridge, you've got to go out and get food. You've got to go out and get water. So you've got to breach a lockdown. And you're unlikely; these people are unlikely to be able to work from home. They're often living in overcrowded situations, often got limited non-existing services, as I've said. So of course, if we adopt a strict enforcement rule toward those individuals, they will be criminalized, and we criminalize the disadvantaged because of their disadvantage. And you end up with this spiraling continuation of disadvantage, criminalization, and so Of course, we've seen some very successful strategies, and those other photos I showed you of the police distributing food, that came from India and Pakistan and Nepal, where the police recognized that there were disadvantaged communities, individuals who were sex workers, who had HIV, who were generally vilified by communities, that if they left them to it, would be even more vilified because they often had to come out on the street. So the police decided that the easiest thing to do was to give them food, water, and so on. The same for homeless people, mentally ill people who are on the streets, because that meant that at least it limited to some degree the way their need to actually break lockdown. But of course, where we've seen successes is where police have actually listened to the concerns of communities and tailored their responses to communities, explained their protocols and the reasons for action, applied sanctions as a last resort, applied them consistently and fairly. Of course, these are all characterized as procedurally just policing tactics. And in this space, they worked as they do generally. And of course, these good examples of this sort of behavior has resulted in greater compliance with health regulations and maintenance, particularly of trust with policing and the legitimacy of police. And somebody made a good quote I heard the other day that said, you can't insult the future. You know, what you do today, even though it's a pandemic, if you destroy your trust and relationship with the community in the guise of, oh, well, we're policing a pandemic, the point is people remember this goes on into the future. Life becomes much more difficult to maintain things as you go. So given all of this, what do we recommend? Well, the point is, policing in these situations is a challenge. It really is difficult. No one's claiming it's easy. But there are certain bits of learning. I think one of the things that comes out quite clear is that police are a critical part of the public health and pandemic response in places where police exist in a way that they can be part of it. But where they do, they are critical. And their actions can facilitate or inhibit public health guidance. They can make it more or less easy for public health solutions to succeed. But of course, and broadly speaking, it's difficult to ensure, in most places, it's difficult to ensure public health, to ensure cooperation with public health, unless you've got someone to support that. You know, public health agencies themselves tend not to have the wherewithal, indeed the legitimacy to go and make people do things in the way that police can. So what would we say? Well, I think it's imperative that police are included in the planning. But there are a number of questions that sit here, and I know that Vicky will consider these later on. Who are the police? You know, what do we mean by police in this space? What should they actually do, and how should they do it? And of course, importantly, what resources do they need to do it? They do need to be given a voice in the creation of legislation, not necessarily to sit down and create a police state if they write the legislation, but they should be given a voice to sit down and think about what implications are for policing when legislation is proposed, and what's missing from that legislation. Importantly, within this space, police agencies do need to develop those relationships with other stakeholders. That's pretty important, and that needs to be done before a pandemic hits. But identifying who they are is quite critical. They need adequate resources to protect staff from infection. That's a fundamental, because we've seen if you don't have that, there's a risk that negative outcomes follow from it. Agencies need to be sensitive to the psychological and physical well-being of staff. And again, for the same reasons, the damage that creates within an organization, if you don't do that, can cause problems. A sort of one-size-fits-all draconian securitized approach is highly detrimental to public health outcomes. It doesn't work. It causes problems. Yes, you need to enforce some of the time, but that shouldn't be the first thing that you do. And really, ultimately, community engagements, ones that we might call harm reduction, the ones that are sensitive to the needs and context of communities from a policing perspective, seem to be much more useful at maintaining long-term compliance and voluntary compliance than anything else. And again, as I say, I think I've already said it, but strict enforcement should really be the last but not the first resort. So ultimately, that's what I wanted to talk about. And hopefully that's given you a sense and an overview of what we know thus far on the back of COVID-19. Do feel free to get in touch if you need a copy of the slides. I do convene along with Michelle McManus, the special interest group in GLEFA on policing pandemics. So we've just started this group. So if you're interested in that as well, do feel free to get in touch with me if you want to discuss that further. So I will just drop this down and I will introduce now our next speaker, who is Professor Mark Harrison from the University of Oxford, who's going to talk to us about the historical context of policing pandemics. Okay, so Mark, thanks, welcome, great to see you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to find my presentation. Okay. Right, I hope everyone can see that and hear me. I will apologize in advance. I've had a few internet issues this morning. Um, I was asked to talk about this at quite short notice, and one of the things that became apparent to me quickly when I tried to put together a presentation on this, I am a historian of pandemics, I should say, is that policing itself is actually very neglected, and as a subject within the history of pandemics, is probably, although it's there everywhere, it's kind of nearly always subordinate to what people have examined when historians have looked at pandemics. But I think before we kind of examine some of the main themes, I think we need to understand what we mean by pandemic policing. And it's quite clear, and I was just sort of picking up on what Carl was saying there, that obviously there are a number of agencies that are actually involved or have been involved historically in policing pandemics. And that needs to be taken into account. When we think about pandemic policing, we need to think of it as really quite something which is really very dynamic, and also, as will become clear, I think, locally specific. The idea of policing pandemics certainly goes back to kind of the Renaissance, and right through from the Renaissance to in Europe through to the early modern period. The job of ensuring that people comply with whatever health controls were introduced in epidemic situations was usually given to people who were hired specially for the job during plague, occasionally to people who may already have employment as night watchmen within larger towns and cities. And the illustration you can see here, which is actually from the late Victorian period, is supposed to depict a night watchman during the plague of London in 1665. But it's probably not a very accurate representation, but there were people of this kind who would walk around trying to ensure that people would comply with whatever public health rules were actually in place at the time. Some of them weren't night watchmen in the sense that they weren't sort of people who were normally employed in those duties. They were often people who were actually among the lowest in society. And this was actually, during pandemics, it was actually an opportunity for people who were socially marginal to gain, or usually very briefly, some kind of position of authority within their societies. And sometimes they were manning quarantines actually had some kind of control over people who would normally be above them socially. Occasionally, soldiers would also be employed, particularly around cities, to prevent people from going out or going in. By the time we get to the 18th century, pandemic management is increasingly militarized, and this is largely a function of the politicization of quarantine, the fact that it's been increasingly used as a tool of statecraft. And also, by that point in time, the machinery of states, at least within Europe, is much more developed, and standing armies and navies have been formed, and those people often provide the main enforcement in the context of an epidemic. And some of these operations are huge. For instance, along the border of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was a cordon which was 1,600 kilometers. That was basically a militarized cordon, basically to protect the Ottoman Empire from plague coming in from the Habsburg Empire, from plague coming in from the Ottoman Empire. It's really by the time we get to the mid-19th century that something like pandemic policing, in the sense that we envisage it today, comes into being, obviously with the creation of professional police forces. And after those forces are created in different countries, they become increasingly involved in quarantine, but also in many other aspects of pandemic management. And that included not just enforcement of whatever legislation existed, but also other things such as contract tracing, humanitarian work, and so on. And I'll just give a few examples of that later. They're also heavily involved in non-pandemic aspects of public health, particularly in the control of what was then known as venereal disease, or today sexually transmitted infections, because that was heavily connected to, or very closely connected to the problem of prostitution at the time. And obviously what happened in different countries varied enormously, depending on the tolerance of prostitution. But although police forces became increasingly involved in pandemic work, the military was still often dominant in other contexts, such as the colonies. And of course, we've seen even during the present pandemic that in some countries, particularly in Africa, for instance, that the military still have an important role. That's just a very brief introduction. As far as the history of pandemics is concerned, as I was mentioning earlier, it's a very badly neglected area within what is actually a very well-developed field of study, that is the history of epidemics and pandemics. Most of the historical work on epidemics is really focused either on government policy or resistance to it. And the police, the policing agencies, really get caught somewhere in between. They're usually seen as kind of instruments of state policy. And that's a big problem, because as we all know, what the police actually do is, in the context of an epidemic, is very important, the way in which they interpret the legislation. But venereal disease policing, which is not pandemic policing, has been examined in far more detail. And we can, I think, pick up some clues there as to what the police thought about their roles. But on the whole, policing, as I say, is a very neglected aspect of the history of pandemics and epidemics. The picture you can see here is actually from the late 19th century in the UK. And this is an incident around the removal of a person who's died from smallpox, and there's clearly some resistance to the body being taken away. It was often around the disposal of the body in funerals that a lot of the flare-ups came, in which the police were called in. But of course, those highly charged emotional situations were very difficult for the police to deal with, as they are today. But it was seen to be necessary, usually, for the police to be present. And that was pretty much true of most countries, as we'll see in a moment. So what we don't know and why it matters. Well, as I said, historians have tended to treat the police and also other enforcement agencies during epidemics as instruments of government rather than actors in their own right, which really means we don't understand how those agencies think. And the ways in which police exercise judgment in the context of an epidemic can actually be crucial in terms of how effective the public health interventions are, and of course, obviously on public order. And when the legislation is maybe itself hotly disputed or at least controversial, the police have a really important role there in trying to liaise with communities and provide them with some assurance. Where policing intervention is heavily militarized, it can often lead to quite substantial outbreaks of civil disorder. And the one you can see in the picture here is actually from Russia during the cholera in the early 1830s in Tashkent. There was a lot of trouble there with really both the legitimacy of the legislation and also of the forces which were brought in to enforce it. So what I'm going to do is, in the rest of the talk, which is the bulk of it, is to focus on some of the key features in the policing of pandemics from the late 19th century onward, to the extent that it's possible to draw that out of the secondary literature on pandemics. So just a brief introduction of Western context. In Europe and also in North America, there's really, from the late 19th century, a huge variation in the policing of epidemics. And this reflects a number of things: national policing styles and political traditions, but also a kind of stance towards particular diseases. For instance, cholera would often be treated in maybe a different way from another epidemic disease. And the precise mixture of those things really as I said, varies enormously from one context to another. And the way in which epidemics were policed, of course, also changed over time, along with advances in medical knowledge and public health priorities. So in some cases, for instance, partly depending on the disease, there's much more focus on preventing contact between human beings. In other cases, maybe much more focus on preventing contamination of the environment, particularly in the case of a disease such as cholera. By the time you get into the early 20th century, particularly, for instance, during the pandemic of 1918, the influenza pandemic, it's clear that a lot of the enforcement issues that forces faced at that time, and the picture you can see here is from the US in 1918, were actually very similar to those today. And in the case of influenza, for instance, one of the key issues was how far should police, or in which ways should police enforce laws regarding PPE and wearing of masks. That was a very highly controversial topic in the US and some other countries, as it is now. Obviously, mobility restrictions, policing of funerals and disposal of bodies and so forth, all those things are very controversial and were dealt with in different ways. And even if you look at what happened in a single country, such as the US, there's a huge amount of variation. So in some cases, within particular towns and cities, the police took a much more relaxed approach, partly because the kind of intervention of this in that city was maybe much more relaxed. So what the police did, to some extent, reflected the local political situation. In areas where the local government placed much more emphasis on trying to control the disease, the police could sometimes be quite harsh in the way in which they dealt with it. There was actually one instance in the US during 1918 where a policeman shot somebody for refusing to wear a mask. So, as I was kind of hinting earlier, the police are also, and as Carl was saying a moment ago, the police are also performing other duties in addition to enforcement. And this included things like humanitarian interventions, like dealing with orphans, particularly in 1918, also providing public health guidance, assistance with vaccination, and so forth, and certification of vaccination in some cases. Just briefly looking at other contexts in Asia, and I'm here looking at non and semi-colonial contexts, so I'll talk a bit more about colonial ones in a moment. Most non-Western countries gradually imported the models of policing and of pandemic policing, which existed in the West. And in Asia, which I know a bit more about than other contexts, this really began in Japan in the middle of the 19th century, with the policing of cholera and also what was then known as venereal disease. And the police duties included pretty much the same things as they did in the West: quarantine duties, monitoring disposal of the dead, contact tracing, and so on. What you can see here in the picture in Japan is Japanese police overseeing the disposal of the dead to ensure that hygienic laws as they existed then in Japan were actually being complied with. On the whole, I think it's probably true to say that in Japan and in some other non-Western contexts, when these policing models were introduced, they were usually actually at least as effective as they were in the West, and were often quite severely implemented. And that was particularly true of most parts of Japan, for instance. In colonial contexts, we actually know a little bit more about policing, because colonial historians have paid quite a lot of attention to epidemics and the management of epidemics and the way in which they have been dealt with. Western powers, Imperial Japan after it developed its empire, and also the US once it had acquired an empire, they all formed police forces in their colonies, and those were used in dealing with outbreaks of various diseases, such as cholera and plague. In the cases of the larger epidemics, particularly the so-called third plague pandemic in the 1890s, troops became widely used, particularly to enforce quarantines, but in many cases also to perform other public health functions, contact tracing, finding victims of disease and their contact, and so the contacts, also forcing people into hospitals and dealing with contaminated premises. And one of the things you can see here in the photograph is actually British soldiers in Hong Kong in 1894 destroying property from houses in which plague victims had lived. And this kind of extensive destruction of property at the time was one of the main causes in Hong Kong of a great deal of public unrest, both rioting and also mass flight of the population out of Hong Kong back into southern mainland China. And there were very similar responses in 1896 after the plague reached Bombay in India and began to spread, first of all, in Western India and then to other parts. A lot of the policing of the pandemic then was put down to the military. The military were very much in control and really cared very little about what the local communities thought about their presence. And that was pretty much an afterthought. And as a result of that, there was a huge backlash in India in those areas affected by plague. And there were a number of attacks on British officials, including murders of some British officials, as well as strikes and mass population flight. And the popular backlash that existed in Hong Kong and in Bombay and in some other places where this very harsh methods of policing pandemics were tried, did force the authorities to use different measures. And one of them was to increase their reliance on community intermediaries. And very gradually, this helped the people enforcing epidemic legislation to work with the communities and to prevent civil disorder, and not actually to get the disease in some cases under control, and to allow things even which were quite sensitive, such as inspection of bodies, segregation of contacts or people who may be suspected of having the disease, and other forms of quarantine. So there was a shift really towards a more consensual approach, use of community intermediaries, and also to increasing use of civilian police rather than the military, because of the backlash that existed, that occurred in the 1890s in some colonial context, and it happened elsewhere too. Here you can see a couple of photographs which sort of show the increasing use of civilian police in two imperial contexts. The one which I guess you'll be seeing on your left, Bombay plague staff. You can see people standing and sitting outside the police station. This is a separate section of Bombay police, which was formed up for plague duties. The European officers are seated in the front, and there's some of the NCOs standing behind them, as well as the Indian subordinate police staff. That way of policing epidemics in India and in many other colonies became one which was much more familiar by the 20th century. In the other photograph, you can see a Japanese policeman, imperial policeman in Taiwan. I think this is from Taipei, dealing with a kind of market situation, an attempt to control the spread of cholera. So it's making sure that local public health measures, hygienic measures in those markets were being complied with. I just want to end by talking about some of the contexts in which we know much more about pandemic policing. And those tend to be contexts of military occupation, and also some international interventions to deal with pandemics, particularly post-war stabilization after the First World War, Second World War, for example. Here, I think it's a fair generalization. The the perceived legitimacy of interventions depended a lot on the local context. And also, I think, on the attitudes of those conducting enforcement in subordinate roles. And because these things have been looked at in more detail in some occupation contexts, we actually do know through diaries, letters, in some cases later oral history interviews, what people who were doing these policing functions actually thought about what they were doing and the people they were enforcing the legislation against. So I'm just going to talk about one example in detail, and then I'll wrap up and draw some conclusions. And this is the Middle East during the First World War. The picture is very complex. If you look at Egypt, where there'd been a British presence since the early 1880s, the policing of epidemics was divided between the military and the civilian police. And this had been the case for several decades, essentially, although in peacetime, most of the policing was done by the civilian police. And you can see a picture here of the Cairo police in 1915 on motorcycles. So you can see there from the picture that they are the civilian police, just as in India. Most of the subordinate police, in other words, the vast majority of them, are actually recruited from locals, usually with European officers. Whereas the military, in the vast majority of cases, are people from the UK, although in the context of the Second World War, from many Commonwealth forces, including Australia and New Zealand. And the epidemics that were spreading around the Middle East during the First World War were cholera, and there was actually a kind of global pandemic of cholera during the First World War, but also some other diseases which were very prevalent in wartime. Typhus was one of them. There was a lot of that in and around Egypt. There were even outbreaks of plague in Egypt, and there was also what was referred to at the time as an epidemic of VD, largely as a result of the influx of very large numbers of Allied servicemen. And the policing of these things varied according partly to the disease and partly where it was happening. So in the larger cities like Alexandria and Cairo, most of the policing was done by the civilians, and there was kind of less of a problem there because people were accustomed to the police. Outside in other areas, like on the around the kind of Suez Canal zone and in Sinai, and this where the troops were moving later on into Palestine. Most of the policing was done by the military, and there was a good deal of tension. And you could see that one of the reasons for the tension, and if you look at the diaries of soldiers and so on who were doing the public health policing, was that they had contempt for the people that they were dealing with. And there's a very large amount of racism and very often brutality and beatings, which are being meted out to the Egyptian staff, including the Egyptian Labour Corps. And this was one of the contributory factors to the revolution that occurred in Egypt in 1919. Obviously, there were many others too, but the kind of brutality that existed, particularly in relation to epidemic management, I think was quite an important factor. In Palestine, where the Allied armies went in 1917, they were basically greeted as an army of liberation on the whole. And although sometimes the policing, the public health policing in some contexts was fairly harsh, on the whole, there was a lot of cooperation from the local population and not much evidence really of violent resistance or even non-violent resistance to public health measures. On the contrary, there seems to be quite willing compliance. And there's a lot of evidence of working through local communities, building up almost from scratch sort of public health detachments from people in newly liberated towns. In Mesopotamia, or what's now Iraq, the situation is incredibly mixed, depending on local circumstances. In many places where the British had come in quite early into Mesopotamia, such as Basra, the relationship was quite good. They built up a good relationship with locals who were kind of worked with them in dealing with epidemics of cholera, for example. Elsewhere, particularly some of the places they went into a bit later, the situation was often much more strained, particularly when they tried to introduce measures such as vaccination. And there, one of the key issues was, I think, that they were increasingly going into towns and cities where there was, which had some sort of ritual significance for Muslims, particularly Shia Muslims. So it was mainly in the Shia pilgrimage centers like Najaf, Fallujah, for instance, where they really received a lot of kickback from the local populations. And that was because I think there was a sense that the policing of epidemics did not reflect the sacredness of these situations. So I think one thing you can say in most of these cases, though, it's that the degree of respect for the local cultures and communities, the intention to work with them, which was really an important thing. But in some places, the situation was really so touchy that the British did not even try to implement public health controls because it would have created a popular backlash. So I think what we can conclude from this is that there's a huge variation in epidemic policing. It's not simply between authoritarian or democratic regimes, but actually within them. A lot depended on the local conditions. They reflected different traditions of governance, also the nature of the disease threat, and many other things. And so even, I think, in authoritarian contexts, there could be an adaptation to local circumstances and a willingness to work with local communities that could actually create legitimacy for intervention, for policing quite quickly. And I think Palestine would be a good example of that. Or, in fact, where legitimacy had been lost, as it had been, say, in Bombay in 1896, it was actually quite quickly regained after they started to work with local communities. And the policing of the pandemic or the epidemic there after that became much easier, much less fraught than it was before. I think decision-making by law enforcement agencies was actually crucial to this. It wasn't simply the legislation that was unpopular, but the way in which the enforcement agencies interpreted it. And I think that when the military, for instance, had control of things in Bombay and Hong Kong in the 1890s, it was pretty much a disaster because they were not prepared to work with local communities. When it devolved to civilian administrations, that became much easier. Although, as I said, in the First World War, sometimes the military were able to accommodate to local circumstances and use community intermediaries very effectively. And they were really crucial for legitimacy in the vast majority of cases. The conduct of the ground level enforcement personnel and their attitude was also incredibly important. We don't have a huge amount of evidence for this overall, because, as I say, this is a very neglected area. But the evidence that we do have suggests that in some cases the attitudes of the people who were doing the enforcement, very often soldiers, were kind of much, well, should we say, on the whole, rather unsympathetic to the people they were to the people in which that they were dealing with. But there are other cases too where it's quite clear that people enjoyed a good relationship with the local communities. And what I think you can glean from those examples, that in the vast majority of cases where they showed some sort of respect for the local community, there was a much better policing relationship, and public levels of public order and trust in the authorities were maintained. So I'd just like to wrap up there. I hope that's sort of given some useful insight, but on the whole, I think, as I say, it's a very sketchy area.
That's great. Thanks so much, Mark. And I do think, as we were trying to illustrate, that sort of long arc of history, we can't neglect that when we start to think about where we are now, and when we look at the strategies and techniques of policing. And I think from your presentation, there are many echoes, which we'll perhaps take up in questions later on, of what we see now in terms of legitimacy, in terms of police reactions and responses, overuse of draconian techniques, and where that takes us. But to move on and continue the debate, we're going to move in to look at the future. So thanks so much, Mark. And we're going to move on now and to introduce to you Dr. Victoria Harrington from the Australian Institute of Police Management, who's going to talk to us about the future of pandemic policing.
Thanks so much, Carl, and thanks so much, Mark. That was an absolutely fascinating insight into the long story arc around pandemic policing. And it's interesting listening to you, Carl, talking about the key learnings that have emerged from this pandemic, impact on policing, the relations we've got with our other agencies and other actors and vice versa, the impact it's had on our relations with our communities, and of course, the impact it's had inside our organisations on our people too. And it's fascinating listening to Mark too, and the lessons we can draw on historically and the impact it's had really on how we have chosen to organise ourselves for pandemics in general. And Carl, I think you made some really important practical points about the sorts of things we need to do in order to prepare for the next pandemic. And I don't want to in any way sort of diminish that, but I want to take a slightly different tack as I think about the future. And I want to approach the issue from a slightly different vantage point. And I do hope that's not stretching the friendship too far. Last year, and probably for most of us this year too, has been a masterclass in complexity. We've faced the unrelenting complexity of a global pandemic, the intersecting impacts of health, security, social and economic factors that seem to twist and turn before our very eyes. We've had the competing and opportunistic complexities of crime and criminal entrepreneurialism. While policing's been significantly impacted by being a key frontline responder to this public health emergency, crime has also continued and morphed, and different types of offending have been spotlighted. Crime certainly hasn't been in lockdown with the rest of us. And of course, while we're doing all this while we're also navigating some complex organisations and complex agency networks. It's not just crime that's complex, so are our organisations. And so is the way we posture ourselves to work with and sometimes inadvertently against other agencies. And I'm doing some work with Dr. Jackie Sabir in Bedfordshire, and this is the point she makes to me oftentimes. When we're dealing with complex social problems, we make it even more difficult for ourselves by approaching it in a fundamentally complex way. So for me, one of the overarching lessons I think we can take from our experience of policing in and of the pandemic is that our environment is complex, and we cannot continue to deal with this complexity in our societies, in our organisations, in our institutional networks, in our operating environment, while effectively having one foot on the accelerator and the other foot on the brake. And I think that in a nutshell and up front is my central thesis. I don't think we can think about the future of policing in and of pandemics without also talking about the future of policing in complexity in general. So without diminishing the importance of the very real practical improvements we might make to policing pandemics, I want to reflect on some of the biggest systemic changes we could make to our whole approach to public safety, including health security, LEPH, and the whole range of complex social problems. And in doing so, I hope I can leave us better able to police future pandemics and all the other pandemic-like issues that are likely to greet us along the way. So to be clear, though, I don't propose that I've got a silver bullet or a clear vision or a detailed roadmap for the future. Neither am I in possession of a crystal ball or indeed any fancy PowerPoint slides. Instead, I'd like to have a conversation about complexity in policing. And to assist, I'll sketch sort of two adjacent possible futures. And they're not intended to be representative of binary choice. It's just really a start at imagineering a future, recognising the realities of our present and past. And then I just want to pose a couple of questions that I hope we'll have time to discuss as a group afterwards. And I'm very interested in hearing your views as we fumble our way to the future. So before I get really underway, I just wanted to give you a tiny bit about the AIPM. We're a national common police service in Australia and New Zealand with a remit for leadership development and education for public safety agencies. We can be found usually on the shores of Sydney's harbour, We're administered by the Australian Federal Police, but we serve all of the ANZ jurisdictions and engage in capacity building work on their behalf further afield. As an organisation, we've been involved with LEPH since Professor Nick Cross and Nick Thompson came along and chewed our ears about it in 2011 or 2012. What I've just realised means it's been a decade or so since I've been admiring their passion and drive. Anyway, the Nicks did not have much convincing to do, because at AIPM we're interested in so-called wicked problems, in complex systems, and in adaptive leadership approaches in particular. So for us, the LEPH challenge encapsulated the broader tensions of inter and intra-organisational drivers, incentives and rewards. It captured for us the importance of being able to boundary span and not rely on one's command authority to get things done. And it prompted for us our thinking about how our organisations position themselves in the institutional landscape, what impact that has on how we engage with complexity, and whether we would be more effective if we chose to do things differently. So for us, the pandemic, in one sense, was being grist for the mill. It's amplified many of the existing tensions and inequalities in society, and it's laid bare the fact that despite thinking we've been dealing with complex social problems such as violence, exploitation, structural inequalities, LEPH for years, we've perhaps not made as much progress as we think we have. And in that sense, it's laid bare the inherent complexity of our modern world and the inadequacy of our organisational responses, including the futility of expecting any one agency to be able to have a meaningful impact on their own. And, you know, as Carl, you and Mark have said, you know, COVID may be a public health emergency, but public health officials are not going to be able to achieve any of their stated outcomes without the police. So for us, it's a bit of a no-brainer, right? Our organisations are inextricably entangled, and we all bring different specialisms and insights to the table. We all have the potential to enhance or undermine each other's contribution. Yet we seem to continue to engage even in areas where we've developed multi-agency partnerships to smooth pathways. We still engage in fundamentally siloed ways. Police run a police agenda because they're funded and incentivized to do that. Health, education, they bring their own agendas for similar reasons. And we're not very good at seeing things from other institutional perspectives. And we can see that through the window of this pandemic. Even within policing, different agencies are driven by their own metrics for success. And in Australia, state politics plays a huge role. And as an aside, which we might come back to, an antidote to that at an individual level can be the personal relationships that exist across organisational boundaries. Social capital, social bonds, I think they hide a multitude of interagency confusion and tension. But before we maybe touch on that, and given everything we've heard and experienced and starting to see empirically from the pandemic, I wonder how we might choose to do things in the future. And I'm interested in your insights in answering this, because the real answer to this question, of course, is it depends. It depends on where one's starting from, what the context is, how successful or otherwise policing the pandemic has been perceived to be. I mean, in Australia, for example, some police forces may feel there is nothing they would choose to do differently. They nailed it. They've successfully policed their way out of the pandemic, or one reading of the evidence. Other places clearly have had very different experiences. But to get us started, I'll sketch two possible futures. And again, these are not binary choices. They're just designed to spark a collective discussion we can have about what we might want our future to be. The first is easy. It's effectively we carry on like we are, and like we have historically done perhaps. We pretend we've learned from the experience of COVID, and perhaps we have in micro ways. Perhaps policing gets a bigger voice in pandemic planning. Maybe some additional money is siloed towards officer well-being, and perhaps even greater organisational efforts are made to rebuild community relations where it's become apparent that those things have slipped away. But essentially, we pat ourselves on the back for a job well done under the circumstances. We feel comfortable that next time we'll have enough corporate memory and sufficient stakeholder relationships and experience to do even better. And then we get back to business as usual, playing whack-a-mole and resigning ourselves to a life of deja vu until the next existential crisis strikes. Second possible future, is structurally and symbolically different in that we recognise complexity. In this alternate future, we think about complex social problems as shared problems. We fund these problems, not agencies, and agencies themselves consider their roles and responsibilities for reaching shared outcomes in expansive rather than narrow, that's not my job terms. In line with what we know about complexity, we leverage diversity of perspectives to properly diagnose social problems. And only then do we think about the interventions that may start to shift the system. And this is far removed, I think, from our current reality, both in terms of structure, but also in terms of the ordering of problem and solution. We often start with the solution first, which is based on our preconceived ideas of what we do, what we think works, and what we think from our own perspective the problem really is. In this possible future, I see an unfashionably expansive role for police, operating out with the confines of a crime and justice frame. I see police consciously embodying a role as a systems agent, as a systempreneur, if you like, variously taking up their role in a way which best suits the situation. I see police working collaboratively and cohesively as part of an interagency response to an interdisciplinarily misdiagnosed social problem. The unique skills of police, the powers of arrest and the threat of coercive force, may not be needed, but that's not the same as saying that their perspectives are not useful in unpacking a problem in all its glorious messiness. Nor is it the same as saying that there are other human skills around positive interactions with the community leadership, around dealing with people in crisis, around mobilizing others, about just getting stuff done, and not vital to the success of identified interventions. Now, of course, one logical conclusion of what I'm suggesting is to dispense with organisations altogether and to create some loosely organised collectives of actors who work for the common good. But given what we know about a desire for leadership and an intolerance for complexity in our organisations and societies, which is another point we might just come back to, I can't see how that doesn't eventually end up bringing us back to where we started. As an aside, the superb Adam Curtis documentary Hypernormalization talks about this intolerance of uncertainty and need for leadership, and how, the egalitarian collectives that emerged in the Occupy movement and the Arab Spring fizzled out, at least in part because of an absence of someone coordinating what should come next. So, and I would say this, of course, as someone who's interested in leadership, but in these collectives, then leadership is going to be important, but so is understanding it as shared leadership. And as such, as a process that emerges from the group rather than the property of any particular individual or agency. Which is to say that in this future, we need to resist the urge to have a lead agency, perhaps, because it inevitably means a fracturing of KPIs that drive inadvertently competitive behaviour. Anyway, what I'm confident in is that we currently have a siloed, competitive and defensive posturing from all organisations working across a range of complex problems. We do not see our responsibilities through a collective lens. We do not see the problem through a collective interpretation, and we're certainly not held accountable for outcomes at a collective level. All of which drives more siloing, more fracturing, more stone throwing, more screeching of our metaphorical car wheels with one foot on the accelerator and the other on the brake without actually getting us anywhere. And all of which would need to change in this possible future. At the start, I promised I would finish by posing some questions that I think could be useful in propelling us forward. So in the spirit of creative imagineering about the future of policing in and of pandemics, as well as at all other times, in my opinion, I want to start from a place of appreciative inquiry. And conversation with a dear friend and colleague of mine, Abby McLeod, today reminded me that we're pretty good at identifying hurdles and barriers, but we forget about the power of magnifying enablers. So to that end, my first question of us is, where in our worlds or beyond is a shared approach to problem diagnosis and solution already occurring? And where are parties being held accountable for shared outcomes? Are there cross-functional teams in our own organisations that are doing this well? Are there interdisciplinary research teams that are adopting a truly shared approach? Mark, I know the Martin School at Oxford's engaged in interdisciplinary efforts for global problems. I'm wondering if that's part of the university system, perhaps, where the incentives for individual success have been weeded out. Second, I think a nice question might be, what do we want the police to do more of? We spend a lot of time telling police that what they're doing, what they're being called to do is not really their job. Paradoxically, we also spend a lot of time telling police we want them to do more stuff. But which of these roles do we want to see more of? Is it responding to calls, engaging in upstream crime prevention? Is it holding the hand of a victim? Is it responding to calls, as I mentioned? Is it delivering the death message, telling someone their loved one is dead, driving fast cars, catching the bad guys, all of the above, and of course, much more. And what are we doing? What are they doing that we would like to see more of? And is that a conversation that we're willing to have? Do we in policing have the stomach for that kind of open debate? Are we prepared to examine the trade-offs? Might there be a kernel of truth in the defund the police movement? I don't know, but provocative questions should be considered our friend. And third, in thinking even more broadly, where are we most comfortable with complexity? And what does that look like? It strikes me that complexity is an uncomfortable concept for most of us, most of the time, inside and outside policing, in politics, and in the broader community. We like simplicity and certainty. And even when we see complexity, and even when we acknowledge complexity, we still like to reduce it to simplicity so we can stick it in a box or count it or fix it. But complex systems shift under our feet. They're what mathematical social scientist Scott Page calls dancing landscapes. Complexity requires us to nudge, assess, nudge again, assess again, and to remain agile and adaptive in our response. And I know policing and universities and healthcare providers and businesses all talk about being agile and adaptive, but I'm not sure how many actually are. Anyway, that's my 3 questions, Carl, and hopefully that will prompt some shared discussion. I'm sure there are plenty of other questions that folk have. Just to recap, in the session, I've taken a very long bow from Carl's invitation to talk about the future of policing pandemics, to talk more broadly about the future of policing in complexity. And I talked about why this is important and sketched 2 possible futures to help spark debate. I've asked 3 questions, adopting an appreciative stance. We start to understand what might help us better orientate to our complex future. I've asked where shared problem diagnosis, solution and accountability is happening. I've asked what we want to see the cops doing more of, and I've asked what being comfortable in complexity looks like. So I hope that gets us started in the time left, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks so much.
So much, Vicky. I think you present some really interesting challenges and interesting questions that I think really sit at the core of how policing should develop in the future and will develop in the future. And as you say, that juxtaposition between we stick with what we're doing and keep it the same and pat ourselves on the back because we've solved some things, or we actually try and move in different ways, or some station between. And I think learning from that long arc of history and where police come from and why policing sits in the way it does, and the role of culture and the role of engagement and its impact on legitimacy, and all of these things we've seen writ large continuously through history, and probably as we move into the future, things that we're going to have to consider. Now, sadly, I've just been told by the organizer thing that we've actually run out of time for the session, which is frustrating, because I think we've got a lot to do, and we could probably bang on for another 2 to 3 hours. What I propose, everybody, and first I would say thanks firstly to all the panelists for coming, I think, and taking part. I know I did sort of rope you into this at somewhat last minute, and I think you've both done fantastically well given the time you had available to draw some threads together. And I think all the people here will agree that the presenter did produce some really good stuff that we can really think about, and brought some new perspectives that I think we do need to look at when we deal with these difficulties and these complex challenges. We have some questions that have come through on the chat. Sadly, we don't have time, because I think the way the conference works, there's quite a butting of sessions together that people need to move over to. So we can have to stop there, unfortunately, and I don't want to be the one to curtail debate. What I would say is, if people have got questions that they want to send through, I mean, my email address is on there from earlier. Do feel free to send an email through, and I'll try and build this debate up. But this debate will continue through the special interest group here, and individuals who are here today, if you're interested, absolutely, let's sort of let's maintain this conversation and continue with it. So I'm sorry we've run out of time for sort of any detailed discussion, and I do think we've almost kind of teased you all with stuff and then we're just about to abandon ship, which maybe there's so much to say we need more time to do it. So thanks everybody. I think Vicky's put her email up there. I just noticed on the chat if you're interested. Mine was on a presentation. I think I'll do the same. It's I'll just put that on now. So again, if you want to contact us, do feel free. Mark's put his up there too on the chat. So just look in there now if you need our email addresses. Other than that, Savete, once again, thanks so much to presenters. Fascinating insights, and I've really enjoyed what you guys have said. It's been really interesting. And for everybody who attended, I'm sorry we didn't get time for debate and questions, but I think this will continue. As I say, through the special interest group, we'll be continuing this discussion. So thanks so much. Do take care, and everybody, wonderful, and thank you for spending your time with us this morning. All the best. Bye-bye now. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Vicky. Brilliant.